Kaur from Makkar IELTS, and this video that I've come up with today will teach you how to make complex and compound sentences in the IELTS graphs. That is task 1 of the academic writing. And believe me, it's a very simple way to make these sentences. We'll be practicing how to write one thing in many ways so that you can adopt one or two ways and you can try to write graphs like that, and you'll not be afraid of making complex sentences. Many students have this misconception in their mind that lengthy sentence is a complex sentence. So that myth will also be removed today, because very small sentence can also be a complex sentence. And believe me, it's going to be very simple. I'll be touching examples from my book of the graphs. I've touched mostly table graph and the line graph, but these sentences can be used in almost any type of graphs. So this is the video that goes. So how to make sentences in graphs? Let's start with three simple sentences. Sentence 1 and sentence 2 and sentence 3. Sentence 1 will talk about value in one particular year. So in 2011 say this value, or 2010 or 2009. Okay. And sentence 2 will be comparing three values in 1 year. Three values in 1 year. So sentence 2 will be comparing three values. This can be three values in 1 year, or this can be three values in three different years. That doesn't matter. Okay. And sentence 3 will be describing a change. That is, a change is change that occurs over time. So it will be describing a change. This is the graph that I've taken from my book as a reference to make these three sentences. The graph below shows the percentage of people who traveled by bus in the UK from 2009 to 2011. So this is the graph, 2009 to 2011, 5 different purposes: shopping, study, work, visiting friends, day tour. Okay. And so the sentence 1, 65% of people traveled by bus for shopping in 2009. This is a simple sentence. 51% people traveled by bus for shopping in 2011. So this is a simple sentence. Sentence 2 is, while 65% people traveled for shopping, a mere 5% and 4% of the people traveled for work and study respectively. So while 65% of the people traveled by bus for shopping, a mere 5% and 4% traveled for work and study respectively. So it is by bus in all the cases, so it's not very important to write by bus every time. So this is the sentence 2. It is using while and then a comma here and then the rest of the information. So while for one, this, and then after a comma these two figures and these two purposes. So this is a complex sentence. Sentence 3. The percentage of people who traveled for visiting friends rose from 19% to 23%. Rose from 19% in 2009 to 23% in 2011. This is a simple way to write the trend. So the percentage of people who traveled for day tour rose from 7% in 2009 to 12% in 2011. So this is it. Now let us practice this again in a line graph. We'll make sentences keeping a line graph in mind. So this is the line graph. The graph below shows the number of students from the US, the UK and Australia who studied in universities in other countries from 2002 to 2007. So this is 2002, this is 2007, and this line is for the US, this line is for the UK, this line is for Australia. These are the three countries, and from these three countries the students studied in other countries, in universities of other countries. So let us say sentence 1, 10,000 Australian students studied abroad in 2002. So one figure, 1 year. So in 2002, 10,000 students, Australian students, studied abroad. Okay. Now in 2004, the number of American students, this is America. In 2004, this year, the number of American students who studied abroad was around 46,000, comma, while the number of British and Australian students was 26,000 and 10,000 respectively. So the number of American students was this much, while the number of Australian and European students was, British and Australian students was this much and this much respectively. Now you can see here in this sentence I've used while in the middle. I could have started this sentence from while also. So in 2004, while the number of American students, so while the number of American students studying abroad was around 46,000 in 2004, comma, the number of British and Australian students was this much and this much respectively. So we can start with while also. Okay. And sentence 3, between 2003 and 2007. Now between 2003 and 2007, the number of British students studying abroad, the number of British students studying abroad fell from 30,000 to 22,000, approximately 22,000. This is a simple way to express change. Okay, so these are the 3 sentences. And one thing I must tell you, do not worry about repetition, focus on grammar. Grammar is always more important. Repetition would not lose as much marks as wrong grammar, right? So many students are very worried, ma'am repeat kar wohi word baar baar aa raha hai. Don't worry about that. Worry about making correct, using the correct grammar and not doing simple mistakes like capitalization errors, punctuation errors. They are more important. Now moving to complex sentences. Let's first understand where complex sentences are used. Complex sentences are used when we try to give more than one piece of information in a single sentence, more than one piece of information in a single sentence. The while sentence we used earlier is counted as a complex sentence because you are comparing data for 2 different things in a single sentence. For example, while I play cricket, my brother plays football. Now here we combined I play cricket, my brother plays football. These 2 sentences. While I play cricket, my brother plays football. This is a complex sentence. I have combined 2 things, right? Now we are going to practice these complex sentences using 1 or 2 more graphs. Here you can see the given graph shows the past and projected figures. Past because this is from 2000, projected because this graph is ending at 2025, which is yet to come. The given graph shows the past and the projected figures of the government spending as a percentage of GDP for the years 2000 to 2025 in 3 areas: education, health, roads and railways. 3 areas are there. This is the percentage spending on GDP of the GDP, and this is the from 2000 to 2025. Now let's imagine you want to tell 2 things about spending on education in 2000. So this is the spending on education. This line is for education, spending on education. Now supposing you have to tell 2 things about the spending on education in the year 2000. So first thing that you want to tell is spending was 5%, and second thing you want to tell is spending on education was the highest in 2000. So highest and 5%. These are the 2 things you want to tell about this 1 year. Okay, so you can say in many ways. In 2000, the spending on education was the highest at 5% of the GDP. So this is using at. You can say in 2000, the spending on education was the highest at 5% of the GDP. You can also say this: in 2000, the spending on education was the highest, which accounted for 5% of the GDP. So this is another sentence in which I have mentioned these 2 things. Another way is in 2000, the spending on education was the highest with a figure of 5% of the GDP. So in 2000, the spending on education was the highest with a figure of 5% of the GDP. So this is 3 ways to tell the same 2 things for one single point, one single year. Okay. There are 2 other ways in which you can say this. One way is to use brackets for the data, and one way is to make it a compound sentence. Okay. So here in 2000, the spending, that now I'll put extra information in the bracket, 5% of the GDP. In 2000, the spending in education was the highest. It should be on here. Okay. the spending on education was the highest. In 2000, the spending on education was the highest and 5% of the GDP was spent on it. Now see, there are two sentences which are simple. I have combined them with this word and. So this is a compound sentence. In 2000, the spending on education was the highest. Put a full stop here and your sentence is complete. Okay. 5% of the GDP was spent on education. Put a full stop here. Start from 5%. Your sentence is complete. Now I am joining these two with the word and. So I am making a compound sentence, which is very easy. You are just joining two simple sentences with a conjunction that is and. Correct? So I think you've understood there are 5 different ways you can say the same thing. Now here, let's try it. Spending on health and roads and railways was the same in this year. For 1 year, spending on health and roads and railways was the same in 2000. Spending on health and roads and railways was 4% of the GDP. Now for this one point, you can say it in many different ways. 3 different complex sentences would be in 2000, spending on health and roads and railways was the same at 4% of the GDP. Now here, complex sentence using the word at. Remember we learnt it just now and how we can use how we can make complex sentences 3 different ways. First is by using at, second is by which. Now let's try this. In 2000, spending on health and roads and railways was the same, which was 4% of the GDP. In 2000, government expenditure on health and roads and railways were the same, with a figure of 4% of the GDP for both. So now you can see it is the same thing which we practiced earlier. You can say this in 3 different ways and you can practice it in 2 more ways. One is by using compound sentence and one is by making it into a simple. In 2000, the government expenditure on health and roads was the same and it was 4% of the GDP. This is a compound sentence. Now this is in 2000, the government expenditure on health and roads and railways was the same. This data I have put in the brackets here. So this is the 4th way and this is the 5th way as we did it on the last page. So this is another way. So this is just a practice of what we have studied earlier and this is how you can say the same thing in different ways. Now let's see another example, another scenario. Here, expenditure on roads and railways is expected to be slightly less than expenditure on education. So here, this is the expenditure on roads and railways and this is the expenditure on education. Now this is the vocabulary of future which is also being used, which you are learning now side by side. Expenditure on roads and railways is expected to be slightly less than expenditure on education. So this is expenditure on roads and railways is expected to be slightly less than expenditure on education. Now you can say it in more ways. Expenditure on roads and railways is expected to be 3.5%. Okay. And you can say in 2025, the expenditure on education is expected to be 3.75% of the GDP. So in 2025, the expenditure on roads and railways is expected to be 3.75% of the GDP. Now let's follow up this line with a complex sentence for expenditure on roads and railways. Okay. We have talked about in 2 simple sentences. In one sentence, we've talked about expenditure on roads and railways and in another expenditure on education. Now let's see. In 2025, the expenditure on roads and railways is expected to be slightly less than expenditure on education at 3.5% of the GDP. So expenditure on roads and railways is expected to be slightly less than expenditure on roads and railways on education at 3.5% of the GDP. Or you can say in 2025, the expenditure on roads and railways is expected to be slightly less than expenditure on education with a figure of 0.25% less. Now let's make a super complex sentence. Let's use while for sentence A and the complex sentence next. So in 2025, while the expenditure on education is expected to be 3.7% of 3.75% of the GDP. The expenditure on roads and railways is estimated to be slightly less at 3.5% of the GDP. I hope this helps. I will end on this note. Make 2 to 3 complex sentences in your graph at the most. More complex sentences don't mean more bands. Your graph should be a mixture of both complex and simple sentences. Don't think you have to make every sentence complex to score high. Just 2 or 3 complex sentences and the whole graph will do the trick. Don't worry about more than that. Just practice these sentences and try to apply them in your graphs, and you are done with your complex sentences. Thank you very much for watching patiently, and please in the comment section put up what you would like me to work on next to teach you things. Thank you very much once again.